The cell phone, a little device with an enormous impact.
It just took off like a bat out of hell.
There are over 2 billion worldwide, and they've changed almost every aspect of our lives.
Hello.
For better.
You can make it a computer. You can check your email.
Web browsing, imaging, music.
Billboard has a ringtone chart.
All this is converging on this little device that you carry with you everywhere.
And for worse.
I have seen cell phone usage in the bathroom.
Everyone read about Paris Hilton's sidekick getting hacked.
But it was a 20-year battle between a corporate giant and a family business that sparked the cell phone revolution.
We literally shut the company down.
From the 1973 race to build the first cell phone.
He said, we have to build a portable telephone. I said, what's a portable telephone?
And we saw Motorola as a roadblock.
To the 10-year struggle to get it on the market.
They said there was no market for this at any price.
George said, you ought to show it to Ron. I said, Ron?
Well, you could imagine how terrified we were at Motorola.
The battle ensued.
We'll take you inside the rooms where the decisions were made and hear from the people who made them. This is the inside story of the cell phone. The cell phone made its official debut in the early 70s, and in little more than a generation, it's become the most popular portable technology in history. But for 10 years, AT&T's Bell Labs and two-way radio pioneers Motorola battled each other and bureaucratic red tape just to get the cell phone to the market, while the rest of the world took the American technology and ran with it. And it all began in the last days of the Great Depression. In 1939, only 35% of American homes had telephones. That same year, the Futurama exhibit at the World's Fair predicted there would be portable wireless phones in the very near future.
Come here.
And they weren't far off. 3 years later, U.S. soldiers carried the earliest ancestor of the cell phone onto the battlefield, the Motorola walkie-talkie.
In World War II, we had a walkie-talkie that was a box about this big. It gave us quite an advantage militarily. It was used in invasion in Normandy and a lot of other areas also.
The SCR 536, that's that big thing that looked like a cigarette carton. They were rather heavy and cumbersome, but they did get portably moved around.
This was a device that gave soldiers the ability to move around and continue to communicate. And it really was the forerunner of what the future was going to be.
After the war, telephone giant AT&T took the walkie-talkie concept from the front lines to the front seat, but the car phone had its limitations.
One way to think about service before cellular is that it was like a TV broadcast station. Imagine a powerful transmitter up on a high spot.
If you had an antenna in New York and you had 4 channels, you only could have 4 conversations at one time in the whole city of New York.
There were very, very few channels. It was a very, very simple system. And if anybody else wanted to make a call, the little red light would come on and say that all the channels were busy.
And they were quite expensive. It was designated as a rich man's toy.
Hello? Hello? Darling.
The cost was high and the service terrible, but there were still long waiting lists to get car phones.
AT&T could see the possibilities of a high-capacity mobile system.
And in 1947, they came up with a groundbreaking way to expand the system.
Instead of having a big, powerful transmitter on a hill, you would have many, many small coverage areas connected together like a grid.
But they needed frequency for it.
So AT&T asked the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, to let them develop a nationwide cellular phone system. The FCC turned them down.
And the battle ensued.
The cell phone's biggest obstacle was another new technology.
Most of the spectrum, which is the highway that the calls run on, was saved for television.
It was difficult for the FCC to take this spectrum away from the broadcast industry, which was, a very powerful industry.
And TV is a lot sexier than a plain old telephone call.
And that was the last anyone heard of the cell phone for more than 20 years. In 1969, television began the move from broadcast to cable, and the FCC realized they had some airwaves to spare. So they set up a challenge. Whoever came up with the best mobile phone system would get the spectrum to develop a nationwide cellular network. Of course, only one company had the means to do it.
AT&T is a $120 billion giant, the largest corporation in the world.
The FCC basically said to AT&T, if we were to take these channels back from TV and make them into a mobile telephone service, what would you do? How would you put such a system together?
So AT&T dusted off their 1947 cellular proposal and pitched it to the FCC. One more time.
At the time, AT&T was the dominant telephone company for the United States. And so AT&T said that we now want to take our telephone service and make it a wireless telephone service for cars.
The AT&T plan divided every city into a grid of cells.
We called it cellular because it looks like these cells where they fit together.
AT&T was working on this idea of having very low-power transmitters. You would have lots of them, and they would cover small areas.
Each transmitter is the heart of its own separate area, or cell.
Once you have small cells, you're serving 20 or 100 telephone calls at the same time.
As a vehicle drives from one cell to another, advanced electronic equipment automatically transfers the call to another cell without the caller knowing it.
I remember seeing the colored drawings that they brought in, that you could see little hexagons.
I reached a point where I could walk up to a blackboard and draw a field of hexagons with my eyes closed. I had done it so many times.
The car would go through the city, and you'd see the phone being handed off. We were very impressed with it, and we were going to let AT&T have the service.
But in 1973, just as the FCC was about to hand AT&T a cellular monopoly, Motorola, a small two-way radio company in Chicago, stepped into the picture and changed everything.
We heard a rumor that AT&T had made a proposal to the Federal Communications Commission. They had come up with a new concept called cellular telephone, and the FCC was just about to make this frequency allocation to AT&T.
Motorola had been a leader in the two-way radio business for decades, and they too had their eye on the cellular game.
We had been doing personal communication since World War II. We really understood this technology, we understood the market.
But an AT&T monopoly would shut Motorola out of the cellular world.
Motorola's fear was that AT&T would control the market. If you own the systems, then you can choose who you buy your phones from, you can force prices down.
Well, you could imagine how terrified we were at Motorola.
With reason, they were worried.
Thanks for using AT&T.
But Motorola wasn't going down without a fight.
We had to do something really dramatic.
I got a call from Marty Cooper, and he said, we have to build a portable telephone. I said, what's a portable telephone? He said, if you take the telephone on your desk and cut the wire off, that's a portable phone. And he said, we have 6 weeks to do this. I said, you're kidding.
And he set up a contest between his team members who could come up with the most interesting portable cellular telephone.
Deep in my heart, I didn't believe we could do it. But anyway, I said, okay, let's take a whack at it.
As a reward for this, I bought his whole team dinner.
Now, a lot of my people never made a presentation to a level like Marty, so a little bit of apprehension. So what we did, we poured drinks in everybody, about 3 drinks. And after the dinner, everybody made their presentation.
And some of these phones were attractive enough to be phones that could be used today.
Yeah, some of them were, like a banana.
Phones that slid open.
And some were like matchboxes.
Phones that opened like a flip.
Flip phones. We had a flip phone.
The phone that we ended up selecting was none of those.
And we kind of called it the shoe phone. It looked a little bit like a boot.
It was a very simple design because they had to keep working.
In just 6 weeks, Motorola built the first portable handheld cellular phone.
And so our management team decided that we were going to put on a demonstration. We were going to show the FCC that Motorola had the technology to build a real personal cellular telephone.
All they had to do now was prove it could work. By the early 70s, America was beginning its love affair with technology. Pong and the microprocessor were fascinating the nation, and the cellular race was on between telephone giant AT&T and two-way radio pioneer Motorola.
AT&T and Motorola had different technical concepts. AT&T saw it as a car telephone service. Motorola thought of it as a portable telephone service.
But the FCC was convinced that AT&T was the only company with the money and know-how to make the new cellular technology work.
We thought AT&T is the company. It was the dominant player, and we were going to let them have the service.
So Motorola went head-to-head with the biggest corporation in the world to prove the FCC wrong. And they had 6 weeks to do it.
We literally shut the company down. We were going to show the FCC that Motorola had the technology to build a real personal portable cellular telephone.
But once they built the phone, the question was, would it work? On April 3rd, 1973, Marty Cooper took his handheld portable cell phone to the streets of New York for a test run.
Who to call? Remember, there was a rivalry going on. The guy that ran the program at AT&T was Joel Engel. And so the first phone call that I made was to Joel Engel.
He's told me that story. You know, Marty and I run into one another.
I said, "Hi, Joel. It's Marty Cooper. I'm calling you from a handheld cellular telephone."
Yeah, that didn't seem like such a big deal.
I don't remember exactly what Joel responded.
It wasn't the first mobile telephone call from a handheld unit. It was the first handheld cellular telephone.
But I do remember kind of a silence and perhaps a gnashing of teeth.
We had handheld units that were about the size of a shoe, like Get Smart.
We chatted for a moment, and that historic event was over.
I honestly don't remember it.
Yes, I remember Marty Cooper's phone call. He did call Joel Engel.
And his call changed the course of cell phone history.
Due to Motorola coming in and saying, wait a minute, we've got a completely different concept, which is portable telephone. You get out of your car and walk down the street and make phone calls. The commission reversed itself and decided that innovation really dictated allowing a second operator.
6 months after Marty Cooper's phone call, the FCC gave both AT&T and Motorola the green light to develop cellular systems.
So that's how the two started competing with one another.
We were going to put in this wonderful system nationwide, and we saw Motorola as a roadblock.
Looking back, we had the arrogance
for using AT&T.
of a monopoly.
They could never understand how a little company in Chicago dared to interfere with their grand plan.
And the race was on. AT&T invested millions developing their car phone system.
AT&T was a deep pockets company. I don't think any other company would have put that many hundreds of millions of dollars into something whose future was uncertain.
But Motorola matched AT&T dollar for dollar.
We spent $100 million in developing this thing, and in those years, that was a lot of money.
You could imagine how horrified the financial people were.
There were an awful lot of people saying we shouldn't invest so much to this speculative effort. But we were the risk takers.
And the risk was huge. Both companies were battling it out for a market that didn't even exist, and some said never would.
AT&T said that they thought the upper limit of subscribers would be about 1 million.
AT&T hired a market research firm. They came back and they said there is no market for this at any price. Nobody even wanted to talk about it.
We are now coming to the beautiful Bell System Pavilion.
AT&T had gone through the picture phone fiasco.
A marriage of sight to the drama of sound.
They had spent a tremendous amount of money, and it just was sort of a marketing dud. Cellular was always looked at, is this going to be another picture phone kind of a thing?
There was an entire undercurrent going on. What do we need this wireless technology for? It's scratchy, it doesn't sound as good as landline technology.
Keep in touch with home by phone.
After all, why would you need to make a phone call when you're walking around? There are phone booths everywhere.
To AT&T, mobile was a pimple on the rear end of an elephant. It had no real contribution to the bottom line.
While AT&T and Motorola spent millions, the years dragged on, and the FCC kept delaying the start of cellular service.
A lot of people criticized how long it took, but I think we have to recognize that no one knew whether the idea of a car traveling along, handing off the telephone call from cell to cell to cell would really work.
People on the go, busy people.
In 1978, 5 years after the first cell phone call, the FCC awarded test licenses to compare AT&T's car phone system with Motorola's portable one.
We started off with 100 customers in Chicago.
In Chicago today, some of them taken part in a trial of the Bell System's advanced mobile phone service.
Customers that say it sounds like a regular landline telephone call.
With the phone, I feel more secure.
It's been terrific.
The best that they've ever come out with, just outstanding.
At about the same time, a Motorola-sponsored trial covered much of the Washington area with personal portable cellular phones.
With one of these sets being test marketed by Motorola, you can call and be called literally anywhere.
And I'm wondering what's going to be for dinner when we get home tonight.
I went with two other fellas across the street to Lancers, and I took the phone out, and I called the maitre d', and I said, would you please have the waiter bring us some water? And he said, who is this? I told him, he looked, and the jaws dropped down, and he poked a bunch of other people and, pointed at us. I mean, it was total disbelief.
Motorola's portable cell phones could handle 100 times more calls than AT&T's car phones, but AT&T's service was much more reliable. So Motorola's portable phones became the standard, while AT&T focused on providing the service. AT&T and Motorola were sure the FCC would finally launch national service, but the FCC kept delaying and delaying.
This just went on year after year. We just kept arguing. The FCC kept extending the time.
Lots and lots of documents and deliberation.
You can't fight the FCC.
And while the FCC dragged its feet, the rest of the world took the American technology and ran with it.
The cellular telephone. It's going to change the way we live and work.
After Motorola's historic 1973 cell phone call, Popular Science predicted there would be nationwide cellular phone service in 2 years. But 6 years later, there was still no service. The problem? The FCC.
The FCC wanted to make sure we had full, fair competition for cell phone service, and that meant months, years dragged by.
Meanwhile, the rest of the world took the American technology and ran with it.
The cell phone caught on much more quickly in parts of the world which were not as technologically developed as the United States.
Japan beat the U.S. to the punch and installed the world's first cellular system in 1979. Bahrain and Scandinavia launched their own systems in 1981.
Other countries ended up ahead of us because the telephone companies were run and operated by the government.
The government in those places took the position that they wanted the system in. In the U.S., the government took the position that it had to think quite a bit about the best way to do it.
Even developing countries started putting up cellular systems before the U.S.
If you were starting from the beginning, it's much cheaper to build a cellular system. You don't have to dig up streets or roads or pathways and put in wires and connect them to every house.
In Africa, for example, they had very little conventional telephone service because it's hard to lay wires and cables through the jungles.
By 1981, almost 5% of Japan and Scandinavia had cell phones. Back in the U.S., the public was still waiting for service. It was a humiliating blow to American cellular innovators.
We started work on cellular first. It was a United States concept. We led in the development all along. And meanwhile, other places just went and put in systems. So we ended up not being first in the world to have a cellular system. And that was really frustrating.
AT&T and Motorola had spent millions developing cellular technology with no return. For corporate giant AT&T, it was an acceptable gamble. But for family-owned Motorola, the stakes were high, and the FCC delay was killing them. So in March 1981, Motorola CEO Bob Galvin took matters into his own hands.
I asked Vice President George Bush, who was a longtime friend, if I could bring my grandson to visit at his office. While I was with the vice president, I said, "Have you ever seen a portable telephone?" And he said, "No, I have not." So I had one with me. I said, "Why don't you call and see if Barbara is at home?" Which he did, and he and Barbara had a nice conversation. George said, "You ought to show it to Ron." I said, "Ron?" Well, the president took a keen interest, and he said, "How are you doing with this?" I said, "Sir, your FCC is holding this up. We've been ready to have this on the market for many months." And he turned to his assistant. He said, "You call those people and tell them to release this right away."
2 months later, after 8 years of bureaucratic red tape, constant delays, and one phone call from the president, the FCC finally gave cellular the green light.
I don't think that the president and I changed the world too much that day, but it was kind of nice to have him on our side.
A month later, the FCC began accepting bids for wireless licenses in the 30 largest U.S. markets. 2 licenses were available in every city. One went to AT&T, the other one was up for grabs.
Everyone was fighting over these licenses.
There were several 100,000 people bidding, and some of them had technology, some of them were just sort of a fly-by-night company. And that makes it a lot more of a chaotic situation.
The FCC took months to evaluate each bid.
That was done for perhaps a dozen cities before the FCC realized that this was just an impossible task.
So many applications flooded the FCC, they had to come up with another plan.
Lotteries. That sounded like a lot better because it would be quick.
Our first winning number is 1.
That was a crazy time. I mean, you had hundreds of people putting in rather silly applications.
You got a lot of criticisms. You're not going to have any kind of considered view as who's the best. You're just going to put it in a machine and pull out the winning balls.
Next, we have 18.
Amid the lottery frenzy, on October 13th, 1983, the FCC finally allowed AT&T to launch the first cell phone service in the U.S.
Yes, Jack. On a cellular mobile phone, you can call almost any place in the world. Hello, London.
The service was a disaster.
In the early days of the cellular networks, there was really just a struggle to get voice working properly. There was a lot of static. There was very limited range. Drop calls were far more common.
Hello! And the phone itself was no better.
They sold for $4,000 a piece, and they really didn't work very well because there weren't very many cell sites around the city.
There's not a lot of demand for $4,000 products that work in a handful of U.S. cities.
Despite the high price and poor quality, cell phones began to take off with the American elite.
Hello? If somebody had a cell phone, like in the movie Wall Street with Michael Douglas, yes, there he was on the beach carrying a huge, clunky old phone.
Originally, they were very much a status item. There was a certain image you would put off if you were talking on your cell phone or your car phone.
People would buy fake antennas just to put on their cars.
Simply because it was a status symbol.
By the mid-'80s, the cellular revolution was ready to reach the masses when the industry almost took a fatal blow. In January 1984, just 3 months after the launch of U.S. cellular service, AT&T's $137 billion empire began to crumble.
Today's settlement ends the biggest antitrust suit in American history.
AT&T, of course, had lost their big antitrust case.
The government ordered AT&T to split up its telephone monopoly and divide its assets, which included half of all the cellular licenses in the U.S.
Under the agreement, AT&T will spin off its 22 local operating companies.
When AT&T was being broken up, it could have been carved up any one of a number of ways.
What did AT&T do? It gave away the cellular telephone service to the local telephone companies.
At the time, AT&T thought it was not giving away much because it was going to retain what was thought to be the crown jewels, long distance.
And just like that, after 37 years and hundreds of millions of dollars in research, AT&T was out of the cell phone game.
Chairman Charles Brown of AT&T at a news conference today, announcing the death of Ma Bell as she's existed for more than a century.
So today really signals the beginning of the end of an institution.
There was a really poignant moment. I mean, we had fought for this system for so many years, And then suddenly, the cellular went to the separated telephone companies, and that changed everything.
And in hindsight, it was one of the largest corporate giveaways in history. And AT&T really never recovered from it.
The breakup of AT&T added to America's cellular chaos. 6 new Baby Bell carriers took the place of one national AT&T system, which meant more delays, more incompatible systems, and more confusion. By the late 80s, CDs were outselling vinyl, Nintendo had replaced Atari, and cell phones were everywhere, except in the US. There were only 1 million cellular subscribers nationwide, and the system was a mess.
The United States was divided up into metropolitan areas, each of which was granted 2 licenses for 2 providers.
The newly formed Baby Bells received one of the licenses in every city. The other was given away by lottery. It took 7 years.
There were almost 500 different regions, and each one of those regions would have different suppliers.
And that created a very fragmented industry.
You could get a cell phone that worked in Denver, but not in Vail. So what's the point if you can't really use it wherever you happen to be?
America's cellular future didn't look bright. But all of that was about to change.
Craig McCaw was a very brilliant businessman, and he saw an opportunity and started buying up smaller licenses.
McCaw has agreed to buy Metromedia.
McCaw had gone in the time when all those systems were being given away by lottery for free and started buying them up.
He just had a lot of guts, and they borrowed a lot of money and kept buying up new properties, creating what was then the largest wireless company in the United States.
By 1993, McCaw Communications had signed up more than 5 million new subscribers, and that caught AT&T's eye.
When AT&T decided to get back into the cellular service business, the obvious place to go was McCaw.
10 years after they'd given away their own cellular licenses, AT&T bought McCaw Communications.
So AT&T spent $11 billion to buy its way back to the table.
AT&T's Robert Allen approved the deal Friday. He shook on it with Craig McCaw Saturday night at New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel.
3 months later, AT&T debuted the first nationwide cellular service, AT&T Wireless.
You could get cellular service virtually anywhere, and it worked. That's when consumers started to use these things en masse.
In 1 year, 18 million Americans signed up for new service, more than double the number from the year before. AT&T was back, bigger than ever with the #1 wireless service in the country.
Call 1-800-IMAGINE.
But Motorola's phones were still big and clunky. So designers went to work creating new, smaller phones for the massive new subscribers.
When they said to me, we had to shrink it in size, I said, look, the next product is going to have to be sexy.
Motorola released the first clamshell phone in 1996.
The first trendy phone was the Motorola StarTAC.
The StarTAC was an instant success and started a revolution in phone design as fashion statement.
The mobile phone is now the latest hot fashion accessory.
You could hang on a lanyard, on your belt, when you're jogging, on your arm. And it was much sexier.
Certainly had the price tag of a designer label.
At 3.1 ounces, it was the smallest cell phone ever made, and it had a strangely familiar sounding name.
The designers at Motorola say they were inspired by Star Trek.
Yes, Captain.
Flip that thing out, and you're communicating with the USS Enterprise.
The phones were popular to own, but service was so expensive, people rarely used them.
At the time, you were paying a per-minute charge as well as roaming charges, and it was very, very expensive. So when AT&T Wireless was trying to attract customers, it came up with the idea of flat rate pricing. Well, the response to that was tremendous.
50 states, one rate.
And so the other big companies looked at this and they had a problem on their hands.
Customers started demanding to be able to use their phone anywhere in the country.
But none of the other cellular providers were big enough to offer national service, so they had to find another way to compete.
Eventually, other cellular providers began to merge.
Bell Atlantic and Airtech came together and created Verizon.
You had SBC and you had Bell South, 2 big regional players combined, and that led to the creation of Singular.
and Sprint bought a nationwide license, and Nextel was growing.
Verizon, Singular, and Sprint all launched their own national flat-rate service. New customers signed up in droves, and AT&T began to lose its edge.
AT&T's own systems were overwhelmed. They had inherited a technical standard the original McCall systems had that was considered inferior.
While AT&T struggled with its outdated system, Verizon, Singular, and Sprint had all invested in new digital networks.
This won't happen with U.S. Sprint.
AT&T had never improved the capability of this network, and the quality just plummeted. And it led to this outcry across the country of complaints.
Can you hear me now?
And the other carriers capitalized on that in a big way.
Can you hear me now?
And started competing on the quality of the phone service.
No matter where you go, your call goes through.
By the end of the year, Verizon had knocked AT&T Wireless out of the top slot and become the #1 service provider in the country.
That was the beginning of the end of AT&T Wireless.
But if AT&T had been slow to adapt to the new digital age, Motorola was even slower. After their huge success with the StarTAC, Motorola resisted designing new phones for the new digital networks.
The StarTAC really set the standard for many years, but over time, competitors imitated it, and it was very difficult for Motorola to get the upper hand again.
Nokia had overtaken Motorola as the #1 handset supplier in the world.
Nokia was really good with design.
At that time, Nokia was doing removable faceplates that consumers loved, and Motorola was bringing out its latest set of devices. And none of them really were the fashion hit that the StarTAC was.
By 2003, the cellular pioneers were in trouble. Motorola was running a distant second to Nokia, and the FCC was about to make life even harder for the already struggling AT&T.
Prior to the end of 2003, you could only have your phone number with the provider that you got service from.
You would stay with a carrier you didn't really like because you didn't want to change your number.
Then the FCC required that carriers allow customers to take their phone number with them.
If you didn't like AT&T Wireless or whatever carrier it was, you could bolt pretty easily and take your number with you.
It was the straw that broke AT&T's back. There was a mass migration away from AT&T Wireless.
Meantime, the larger AT&T company was having a lot of problems.
AT&T was effectively bankrupt.
In a moment of just divine stupidity, the decision was made to spin off and get rid of the wireless company. And that was the end of AT&T's connection to the cell phone business.
And while AT&T and Motorola struggled to keep up, the rest of the industry was about to explode. By the dawn of the 21st century, there were over 1 billion cell phones worldwide, and almost half of all Americans had cellular service. Cell phones had already gone from being an elitist toy to a useful gadget. Now they were becoming a necessity.
The flat rate really stimulated usage of the cellular networks. Consumers weren't watching the clock as much as they used to.
Now I can find out if I need to pick up the dry cleaning on the way home.
Do you want this kind of cheese? Do you want the skim milk? Do you want the 16 ounce? Do you want the 12 ounce?
It became more and more difficult for people who didn't have cell phones to function in society.
Once a large enough group of people have them, the people who don't have them are noticeably out of touch.
But it was an unexpected new market that really pushed cell phone use over the edge.
Teenagers were the cutting edge of cell phone adoption in the United States.
Teens talk more. And so a communication technology that enables this is going to be really popular.
And once teens got a hold of cell phones, they weren't just for talking anymore.
In the summer of 1998, the teens in Europe somehow discovered that you can send messages to your friends for free.
Text messaging wasn't a documented consumer feature on cell phones. And people figured out how to use the call notification system to actually send messages to one another.
And it just took off like a bat out of hell.
Text messaging has even had major political impact around the world.
It's been a way that people are able to organize and demonstrate against the government.
Text messaging forced a political change in the Philippines. Text messages went out to thousands upon thousands. There was a massive demonstration in Manila, and based on that, President Estrada actually stepped down.
and texting was just the beginning of what you could do with a cell phone.
Once cell phone usage got to a certain rate where it becomes something that's wed to you like a piece of jewelry, industry realized that this is the device that we can add everything else into.
Once you add more features, you are going to sell more phones.
They started adding cameras.
Everybody look at me.
They started adding video. They started adding MP3 players.
With the popularity of iPods, it just became natural to want to meld those two things together.
Imaging, music, web browsing, all this is converging on this little device that you carry with you everywhere.
And the smartphone was born, a combination cell phone and PDA.
We call it a smartphone.
People would say, gee, why do I have to carry these two things around? Can someone just put the two things together? And that was really the impetus behind what eventually became the Trio.
You've got BlackBerry and you've got the Trio. The Motorola Q is the newest entry into the smartphone market.
We can make it a computer. You can check your email.
The Sidekick is the smartphone for younger people. And a lot of people are using it just because it has IM.
By 2005, sales of smartphones like BlackBerries, Trios, and Sidekicks had quadrupled, and cell phone users got used to having the power of a PC in the palm of their hands.
There's actually more memory and computing processing power in my Trio in my pocket today than the computer that I used to design the original Palm OS, which strikes me as really ironic.
But the more powerful a cell phone becomes, the more vulnerable it can be.
If you are embedding so much information in one particular device, if the device can access the internet wirelessly, then it is vulnerable.
Paris Hilton has been exposed again.
Everyone read about Paris Hilton's sidekick getting hacked.
That was big news, and there was photos, a lot of incriminating information.
When Lindsay Lohan's sidekick was hacked into, it ended up being a teen celeb war, and Lindsay Lohan accused Paris Hilton of having it hacked.
And privacy wasn't the only danger of the cell phone. It didn't take long to realize that convenience had a downside.
I don't know if cell phones have made people more rude, but they've definitely given an opportunity and a new way to be rude.
Basically, everyone who has a cell phone believes that they are polite with their cell phone and that everyone else is rude with their cell phone.
Hello? It's disrupting in restaurants, it's disrupting in theaters.
It makes us all reachable, all accessible.
The cell phone has ushered in the age of the golden white lie. Gee, I didn't hear the cell phone ring.
We have to develop a new culture of courtesy around cell phones. We're still learning how to do that.
I have seen cell phone usage in the bathroom.
And there are times when it's good not to be reachable.
But there's one sure way to avoid any unwanted cellular interference.
The fact is that every cell phone is equipped with a marvelous piece of technology that lets you escape. It's called the on-off switch.
But as the cell phone becomes the center of our technical universe, will anyone ever turn it off? By 2004, Americans made more cell phone calls per day than anyone else in the world. But after years of battling it out with each other and the FCC, AT&T and Motorola had lost their edge in the cellular market.
Singular made the acquisition of AT&T Wireless to put together the largest wireless company in the United States.
And Motorola lagged behind trend-setting manufacturers like Samsung and Nokia.
We were going through a difficult phase in the early 2000s and lost the #1 position to Nokia.
Motorola was known for these very rugged phones. Nobody really took them very seriously in terms of design.
But in 2004, Motorola went back to its roots and broke new ground with a new phone and a new design.
The Razr took the market by storm and became the phone that you needed to have.
Razr was so different. These were going to be something that young people were never going to leave home without. It was going to become an extension of themselves. And that's what changed this whole thing called the cell phone industry to what we call a mobile device industry.
And mobile devices are becoming less about the phone and more about the device.
People won't even be talking anymore about television, computers, and cell phones. They're all going to become the same thing.
The main drive behind it all? Cash.
There's a real limit to how much money you can make off people talking to each other on the cell phone.
It really relies now on getting more revenue from the existing customers.
Listen, my friend.
cell phone companies want to offer features that they can hopefully get you to pay more money for, such as downloading music videos for $2.50 a pop.
The next thing they're trying to do is TV.
They are now producing programming for the cell phone.
Lost created mini episodes that would only air through your Verizon phone.
I mean, who thought that people would be watching television on their cell phones?
The audience is still fairly small today, but there's actually the potential for cell phones to drive entertainment.
It's already had a huge impact on the music industry.
The music industry has come to see the cell phone as a potential savior. Ringtones are an increasing market share.
The fact that Billboard has a ringtone chart kind of shows how important music content on cell phones has become.
The ringtone Crazy Frog actually topped the UK singles chart, beating out a Coldplay single.
And as the technology advances, there will be even more convergence.
In the next few years, you're going to see a big quantum leap with the new technology.
It will allow on your cell phone to get the same sort of fast experience you have with the internet as you have today using high-speed systems at home.
In the future, we'll say, do you remember when I had to get on the internet? I had to go home? Like, why would I have to go and log in?
And what else does the future hold?
The FAA is reevaluating bans on cell phone service in airplanes.
Voice activated is going to catch on and be much more prevalent.
It will be physically integrated into our body. In fact, we kind of see it already with people who wear these things in their ears.
You definitely look like Uhuru from Star Trek when you wear the Bluetooth earpiece.
Somebody is going to figure out how to take all of that information about your body and when you're sick, deliver that to a doctor.
And eventually, almost everything you have in your pocketbook can be put on a telephone.
Forget cash. You're going to carry your wireless device, and that's going to be your ATM card, your credit card.
In Japan, they already have 10,000 stores where you can actually pay for things using your cell phone.
After 35 years and hundreds of millions of dollars spent struggling with a meddlesome FCC, a resistant public, and brash new companies, both AT&T and Motorola have come out on top of the cell phone game.
Hello?
Motorola has the hottest phone on the market.
Motorola is the most popular right now because of their Razr, and they're really leading the market.
And AT&T is re-emerging as the top service provider.
It's a little bit like the Lion King circle of life. AT&T started it, gave it up, it split off into a bunch of permutations. AT&T Wireless gets acquired by Singular.
Singular, which is owned by Bell South and SBC, will become known as AT&T. So it all goes back to where it started.
The rise of the cell phone has created a $100 billion industry and affected every aspect of public life.
The cell phone has been the most significant agent for change in human life since the alphabet.
We had a story that in 2025, cell phones would be implanted at birth, and if you called somebody and they didn't answer, you would know they had died. It was sort of like science fiction daydreaming. I don't think anyone expected it to happen in 20 years.
Of all the media in human history, I think the cell phone is by far the most human in terms of fulfilling what we as human beings want. And people are going to look back in centuries and millennia to come and say that we here at the beginning of the 21st century really began to get it right as far as what we want in our communications.